Greetings. We are entering week 4, and week 4 is pretty much the midpoint of the term. The terms are 8 weeks plus 2 days, so yeah, even an English teacher can figure out halfway is 4 weeks. This week we are going to be discussing gender issues in mythology. And often when we say gender issues, our minds go to the issues of female, but gender applies across the board to males and transgender people. And so this week we will not be specifically zeroing in on aspects of female issues or male issues, but again, across the board. There are 2 assignments this week, and they are, I wrote them down, a discussion board on gender issues in modern media, where you will be choosing an ad or a song or something from modern media and discussing how it portrays some aspect of gender. And then there is a journal for 4.2, where you will discuss a news article and your experience or your take on the gender archetype that might be present in that news article. There are no milestones this week, and I will get those milestones back to you as soon as possible, but again, there is no milestone due this week. And I want to keep it brief this week because last week I rambled on forever, but I do want to mention some aspects of gender in myth and fairy tales. And again, sometimes the most obvious thing comes up is how women are portrayed, the archetype of women in fairy tales and myth. In many mythoi, which are the myths of many cultures, women are portrayed as being passive and being subordinate or submissive to men, but not always. And several of you have chosen the topic of women warriors. And we can see how, and this has to do with science as well, science and myth, how modern archaeology has shown that some of the myths that were perceived as pure fantasy are based in reality. And of course, the one that I mentioned to several students in discussions is that of the Amazons, and how now it is generally accepted that the myth of the Amazons is based on Scythian women warriors, and we have found their graves that support this. In Celtic culture, women were warriors, and the most well-known woman warrior in Celtic culture was that of Boudica, and her name is spelled different ways and pronounced different ways, but Boudica is probably closest to it. And how she came closer to running the Romans out of Britain than any other Celtic leader in history. There's also information that has come to light recently, especially with more archaeology digs, about Norse women and the part that they played as being warriors and fighting alongside Norse men, and that is portrayed in the myth of the Valkyries, who were the daughters of Odin, but still probably myth reflecting real life. We see in fairy tales the princess waiting for the prince to come save her, which has affected generations of young women, and I think older women, waiting for their prince to come. But what about the prince? The prince is stereotyped and archetyped as well. The prince who comes to save the princess in the tower is brave, rides a white horse, and has many other elements that have influenced how we have looked at men, as well as we have looked at women. And in myth as well, we see these archetypes of males, and the hero's quest is one, and how we see heroes. And some of those myths are rooted in, some of those fairy tales are rooted in myth. And I can think of Perseus, how he rescued Andromeda from the sea monster. which probably had a direct correlation to the many princesses who were saved by the princes. And so we have these archetypal standards for men as well as women. Transgendered people have been around forever. And Native Americans knew this, and they had different delineations for genders I won't say in all Native American cultures, but certainly in some. And if we go back to myth and trace that back, and I'm going to go to Greek myth. First I'm going to go to Egyptian myth. In the Egyptian creation myth, there is Atum, who is referred to as the great he, she. Now, there are variant Egyptian myths, and so Atum might be portrayed differently in one myth as opposed to the other, but there is the hymn to Atum, which I will try to remember to share in the discussion, again, in which this deity is called the great he, she, a hermaphrodite. In Greek myth, we see this as well. And we think of Eros, who is known as Cupid in Roman myth, and totally got mixed up there because Eros was not a cute little Cupid shooting bows and arrows, but is also referred to as being double-sexed. Eros is also known as Phanes, Phanes, who was also double-sexed. These double-sexed deities really make sense in light of creation myths, where there was only one entity rising out of the abyss, and it actually makes more sense to have a double-sexed deity than a single-sexed deity. Even though the Greeks were not really clear on the concept of conception, the early Greeks thought that women could self-impregnate. They thought that women, and not just women, but females of all species, could become pregnant by the north wind, and that women could become pregnant by eating beans, which contained the souls of the ancestors. And this is in Robert Graves' book, The Greek Myths, which I'm not going to cite here, but it is in there. This was also present in other mythoi, and one other that it was present in, not with the beans, but with the concept of the ancestors being reborn, was in Australia and Aboriginal myth, which also thought that if a child looked like an uncle or another relative, that it was because that child was a reincarnation of that person. So not always clear on the concept of conception. Now later in Greek myth, and we see this chronicled in the Orestia, and then the play, I want to say Aeschylus, and I'm not sure, but I will definitely check that out and post about it in discussions. In the Orestia, Orestes kills his mother Clytemnestra because she killed his father Agamemnon when he came home from Troy. Now, the Furies hounded Orestes. That was their job, and one of the worst things you could do was to commit matricide. So, the Furies were hounding Orestes, and he petitioned Apollo for respite from this chasing him around the world and not letting him rest. And so the first recorded murder trial took place, and it was for Orestes killing his mother Clytemnestra. And Apollo argued that women were not related to their children, not by blood. He proposed that women were only incubators, and the man deposited via sperm into the woman. He deposited a teeny tiny little baby, and she nurtured it. She, from the point of view of that, the baby grew in her, but she wasn't related to it. And Athena actually gave evidence for Apollo and for Orestes, and agreed with this and said, I am proof of this because I was born from my father's head. I didn't have a mother. And the trial was a hung jury, but Athena had the deciding vote, and she went with Orestes, and Orestes was off the hook. They had to propitiate the Furies because the Furies were, we get the word furious from that. But it was established, and women were demoted even from being blood relatives of their offspring, which is a bit sad. I am already up to 10 minutes, so I am going to stop at this point. But we will discuss these issues in the discussion. And again, you have the journal. I do want to remind you for the journal to check the rubric. It's the same rubric for the journal that was used before. But remember, you need to incorporate your personal experience with this news article. Be sure to see if the directions say answer all of the prompts or choose a couple of the prompts and reply to them. I really am going to stop because it's 11 minutes, but there are some written instructions below.